The last important piece of the robot lifecycle is measuring how the robot is doing. Now, as we can see in the graph, measuring happens in each phase of the robot lifecycle. And it is an important aspect of the implementation of robots within organizations because it allows you to monitor your return on investment, but also to celebrate successes within the organization that will help you tremendously during the implementation. So obviously, we want to know how our robots are doing. And there are a lot of different ways we can measure the success of our robots. But typically, when we look at the way we should measure progress, we can use metrics that are collected manually at the beginning of our automation and at the end of the automation and see whether or not there is a difference. We can use the orchestration tooling that exists within the organization because usually, besides monitoring, it also allows you to collect metrics for the robots. And we can use process mining to see whether or not our automation made the processes more productive and effective within the organization. Now, typical metrics we want to look at is the frequency in which processes are executed, the effort that it takes to execute the process, and the number of actions that need to be taken by humans either before or after automation. We want to, of course, look at the cost. So that is the cost gained by doing away with the manual labor, but also the total cost of ownership of the robots. We want to look at deviations in the process and where processes are not being run as effectively as they should have been. And we look at errors and quality. So that is how effective our robots are at actually executing the different processes and if there are a lot of errors involved. Because as we will come to learn throughout this learning path, errors are definitely a great source of cost within robotic process automation. So you want to limit them as much as possible. Now, during this learning path, we will provide a lot of detail on the metrics that we will use to effectively monitor our robots. But it's important to keep in mind that this is definitely a part of the robot lifecycle and should be taken into consideration from the get-go when organizations start implementing robotic process automation. Now, when we look at the different phases for measuring robots, there are a couple of phases where we want to pay special attention. One is in the discovery phase, where we want to baseline the process that we are currently examining. If we have the metrics down of that particular process without it being automated, it will give us a good baseline in order to measure the effectiveness of the robot over time. Then during the design phase, it will allow us to create a business case. And eventually, in the deployment phase, we will be able to measure the benefits of our actual robot deployment in the process. So that's why it's important to keep measuring the effectiveness of your robots throughout each aspect of the robot lifecycle. Alright then, that was it for this module. Let's do a small recap. For a recap of this short module, we took a short overview of the software robot lifecycle, and we realized that in the discovery phase, we have to identify the processes that are most suitable to be automated by means of software robots. This is done by either process mining software, or it is done by modeling the processes that exist within organizations. Then we looked at the design phase, and we realized that it's important that we identify each specific step in a process and determine whether or not that specific step, trigger, or decision is suitable to be automated by means of software robots. Then we looked at the development phase and testing phase of robots, and we realized that this is mostly dependent on software created by RPA vendors. The deployment of software robots either happens in the cloud or on premises, and the maintenance of robots is usually done by orchestration tooling that is provided by RPA vendors, which allows for the scaling of robots and the measuring of performance of robots. Lastly, we learned that it is important to measure the effectiveness of your robots throughout each phase of the robot lifecycle. This will allow you to create a baseline of the process, and once you have implemented the robots, you will be able to measure the effectiveness of your robots in the process, but also the effectiveness of the robots over time. Now, throughout this learning path, we will go into great detail for each of these aspects throughout the robot lifecycle. But for right now, it's important to realize that it's not just about developing robots, but also discovering the right processes and deploying and maintaining those robots within the organization in order to maintain the highest return on investment. Alright then, that was it for this module. In the next module, we will look at how organizations typically implement robotic process automation and what the different steps are for a successful implementation.